Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining the conversation, and welcome to a new reality AR VR applications manager at outlier.org and a former associate at GSV Ventures. I'm thrilled to be accompanied by such amazing individuals in the AR VR technology space, and would like to quickly briefly introduce who we have on our panel today. We have Frazier, founder of KaiXR, Vijay Ravindran, CEO of Floreo, Sean Strong, co-founder and CEO of Grove XR, Amrutha Vasan, co-founder of Inspirit, and VP of Simulation, Ascend Learning, with a focus on Cognito's virtual humans. Thank you all so much for being here today. We'll go ahead and kickstart right into the first question. So I guess, obviously it's a unique time, so I want to address this right off the bat. What was the state of AR, VR adoption in education prior to COVID? And how do you believe this pandemic has altered it? Kai, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure, thanks for having me. So I will say that honestly, most of the schools that I worked with never thought about AR, VR before COVID. When I brought it up, it seemed like it was this futuristic, unattainable, and unrealistic learning solution. And then COVID hit. So education is really struggling to find distance learning opportunities, and mixed reality has its chance to have a moment now. But I think that it only will happen if we can think about AR and VR in a way that really comes to the challenge of these unique educational needs we see in schools. So I'm looking at things like, are we rising to the challenge for our smartphone users? Is our AR, VR good for curriculum development? We want something that's not just gimmicky, but will actually reinforce what we're learning in schools. And then do we have content that represents our unique student bodies?
Makes total sense. Sean?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting, actually. I think if you look at kind of the VR, especially the standalone VR space, I think it's enabled a lot of schools to start experimenting with VR technology. And we saw sort of an increased adoption curve until COVID. You sort of had these VR labs spring up, maybe 20, 30 headsets. But the issue was that if no one's at school, then you can't use your headsets anymore. And even if schools want to try and do remote learning, it's really hard if you have 20 headsets and 2,000 students. Who gets access to the headsets? And so we see now with some schools starting to come back as well, there are a lot of sanitation issues around VR, right? It's on your face. I don't know if like coronavirus it's a viral disease that spreads through the mouth. And so I think there are a lot of different interesting barriers that are popping up, which we certainly as a business did not anticipate. But I think do kind of push the narrative forward. I think for us, and I think for VR education, one of the most exciting components is sort of this idea that anyone can learn with VR. But the issue is that anyone, anywhere, right? So you can do it remotely. The issue is that before it was just kind of this pie in the sky dream of what education could look like. And now it's become very visceral and very real. So I think in that sense, it's good. But in terms of schools closing down and not using VR, as a VR company, that's not always great.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And you mentioned a couple of the barriers to entry and barriers to adoption. But in a perfect world, let's say those barriers didn't exist, what role could AR and VR play in distance learning and helping address some of the challenges we've seen distance learning have during COVID?
Yeah, I think as a company that sells software for the purposes of special education and helping kids with special needs, like with autism, we know that distance learning needs to be more than just video conferencing, that to learn the type of skills that special education delivers in the classroom today, it can't be replicated simply with Zoom. And so the special opportunity we have is to use VR and AR to potentially create the learning environment that does that. So for distance learning, that's also meant not just delivering VR content, but also coming up with models for the school systems to be able to ship equipment that's ready to use, also be able to set up environments for special education professionals to be able to deliver the actual treatments over the internet.
Yeah, and go ahead, Amrutha. I was going to ask how you think about this when it relates to content.
Yeah, so I think from a content perspective, one of the obvious use cases are people are looking for replacement to labs, right? Physics labs, chemistry labs. So VR is obviously a great use case for that, and so is AR. But it's also really interesting because we always came from a place where we thought schools would still be in session. And so we were never trying to replace anything that was in the school itself. We were trying to kind of bridge that gap in STEM education. And something really interesting is teachers are actually willing to try out these new products because teachers are so busy and they just don't have the time. And so you have this one group of teachers that, because they've been forced into remote learning and they're realizing things like Zoom and YouTube videos don't necessarily work, they're willing to try out a lot of VR products. But then I think one of the big cons that I think Sean mentioned earlier is just the cost of headsets. And obviously not every kid has a headset at home. And so like Kai mentioned earlier, it's really important to be accessible on smartphones and laptops. And the way that you want to think about VR is not necessarily these high-end headsets, but how do you make good content that's interactive and immersive no matter what device anyone's using.
Definitely. And you know, going back to the thread of just continuing on actually in this thread of COVID, in a world where kids are not being socialized to the extent they should be, and they are being deprived of peer interaction, how can virtual humans aid in building soft skills and helping with a child's social emotional development? Deb, I'd love to have you start this question.
Sure, thanks for having me. So remote learning presents a challenge for social emotional learning because typically it's done in class and in person. Now that we've focused more on the distance learning side of things, depending on kids' home situations, they may not be able to discuss their feelings and those emotions and social interactions. School is also a safe place where kids can typically speak more freely, and their homes may not actually be a safe place for them to speak. Teachers have less opportunities to observe potential ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. And so by being unable to meet children's needs, then their learning will struggle. So we use virtual humans, which teach social emotional learning skills, but also give learners the opportunity to practice those skills. So we focus on relationship building, on empathy, problem solving, self-awareness, and we really focus on teaching these skills and practicing these skills not only for educators and for students, but for the entire community. So when you engage the entire community, you drive more conversations, which drive more respect, which result in better relationships, which in turn lead to more conversations. And so you create this holistic cycle that really strikes community engagement and essentially leads to a more supportive school climate and more success for students and their well-being.
Vijay, what's your take on this as it relates to social emotional development? I know, Florio, you're focused on the special education market, so would love your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, kids with special needs like autism are struggling right now because they're really missing valuable practice in developing their skills, and they're falling behind, and they have more intense needs to develop those soft skills that we think about. And you know, loss of structure can really hurt their ability to maintain good regulation. So what we're doing in virtual reality today is creating scenarios where they can practice their conversation skills. The avatars are guided by the specialist to keep the conversation going, go into different types of branched dialogue. Additionally, we have scenes that mimic the sensory calming rooms that a lot of affluent schools have today. And so those scenes can be leveraged to both act as a reward to help children stay motivated to keep going through the types of educational experience they're having at home right now, but also to potentially help them be able to avoid meltdowns or other types of situations where they get dysregulated and maybe brought back in.
Yeah, and speaking of meltdowns, I have to ask a question on parents and how they can, handle all of this. And Deb, you also mentioned the community aspect, which brings me to whole child learning. So what role, especially in a time like this, do parents have in adopting AR, VR, where whole child learning, frankly, has just taken on an entirely new meaning in the wake of school closures? Deb, I'd love for you to start and maybe share your perspective on this.
Sure. Parents, as social emotional learning touches the parent side of things, not only the goal with what we do with virtual humans is to engage the educators so that they can build relationships with their students and encourage that social emotional learning. But you can take that and put that onus on the parents as well. There's no reason that parents can't learn these skills as well. We focus with our virtual humans on techniques like open-ended questions and building rapport and reflective listening, so that if you place that in the hands of parents as well, you build better relationships there, and you're just adding to that community holistic cycle.
Yeah, in the context of special needs families, it's really exciting right now. We have school districts that are deploying Florio virtual reality systems into families' homes to deliver this type of specialist therapy style of learning. But what's also powerful is that the parents are getting exposure to the technology and have access to the same capabilities at home. And so we're really opening the door in a way that we haven't before, where parents can be doing supplemental work with kids or practice reps with kids while the specialists are delivering the coaching and the management of that lesson plan, and being able to coordinate, since this is all being done through online tools, to be able to coordinate and understand progress in a comprehensive way.
Yeah, I mean, that all makes total sense. And I think, one question that I have, and prior to that, I have to say I'm excited to see some live Q&A pop up. So we will be addressing Q&A from our audience in the last 15 minutes. So please keep the questions coming. We'll start that at around 12:30 or so. Kind of shifting gears a little bit, and would love to get Kai and Sean's perspective on this. But, how do you think about accessibility when it comes to AR and VR content, right? Like, how can AR and VR cater to non-traditional diverse learners like the ones you're serving, Kai? And then also to that teacher, Sean, and would love the teacher's perspective.
Or I can say that from being a teacher, our reality was that 1 out of 3 Black teens do their homework with a smartphone. And this was before COVID. So COVID really put a light on the current tech capabilities or lack thereof in education. AR works phenomenally well with smartphones. Mobile VR is a great first touch point for schools. So as educators, we're going to have to lean into these realities if we are serious about providing equal educational opportunities for all students. My company specifically is mobile first because that was my reality while teaching in the classroom. In addition, a lot of the VR content doesn't look like diverse student populations. It was very common that when teaching, my students would ask me, where am I in the textbook? So I don't want to have to repeat have those same conversations with a digital VR AR world. So I'm hoping as educators, we all lean into the call of accessibility and representation.
Oh, Sean, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm learning how to do Zoom. I think one of the core reasons we decided to start Grow is we built educational VR apps, and we found that they were really hard for teachers to use. And then we heard stories of Google Expeditions, and when people would roll out Google Expeditions, and Google did a program where they give it away free for schools, there'd be certain teachers who'd be shaking because they were so terrified to use these mobile headsets that they put on their kids, because it's virtual reality. It's terrifying. It's exciting. It's the future. But is this going to put me out of a job? What does this do? How do I use it? This is hard. And for us, we realized if we didn't make it easy for teachers, there's no way people were going to be using our apps. And the more time that we spent on the question, the more time we realized that actually making the technology accessible for any teacher, not just a tech-savvy 20-year-old teacher, but for the 50-year-old teacher who really would prefer not to use technology, is actually incredibly important in order to kind of reach that mainstream adoption. And if you look at kind of income levels of different communities as well, generally speaking, looking at more affluent communities, they've higher tech literacy. And so for them, it's a lot easier. Of course, I have my VR headsets at home. It's very easy to use VR at school. But when you're looking at low-income communities specifically, you actually don't have that. And so the kid's using VR for the first time, which means that teachers have more of a logistical overhead. And maybe the teachers never used VR. And so these kinds of questions pop up, and they're not immediately obvious. But as we found in building apps, they're incredibly painful. We heard about a story of a public school in Mississippi where they got 20 Oculus Go's. They were incredibly excited about it. And then what happened was the teacher leans down and listens to every device to make sure that they're in the right application. And if they think something's off, then okay, they rip off the VR headset, they put it on, and they're looking everywhere. But the problem is, what about the other 19 students in the class? And what about your responsibility as a teacher when someone walks in to protect the other 19 students in the class? And so for us, we just found that making it accessible to teachers is actually incredibly important for having mainstream adoption. Because we built apps, and I don't know if our apps are quite that good, but what we know is that they're really hard to use. And for us, our whole mission and goal has really been, how do you make that technology easy for teachers, such that the teacher in Mississippi doesn't have to lean down and listen anymore, right? They can just have a pretty simple, intuitive interface to be able to interact with it. And for us, we think that's a big hidden problem that no one's really talking about, is how do you make this technology accessible for teachers, not just students?
Yeah, and And by making it accessible for all types of teachers, you're serving all types of communities, to Kai's point. One question, a quick follow-up to that came to mind is, so much of ed tech adoption is hindered because teachers just don't trust the technology. How do you create a trust within teachers towards that make them more inclined to adopt AR and VR technologies? Because the reality is a lot of teachers distrust the technology today.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure the other panelists can speak to this. I can tell that on our end, we send lots of emojis with our in-chat messaging. We really try to make the interface as simple as possible. That's kind of been our key focus. Some might call it obsession, is how do you show when any issues pop up, how do you automate away problems that they don't really need to be worrying about? It's often the small things behind the scenes that teachers shouldn't really need to think about, right? That we really try to make it more accessible with, but it's hard. We found, and there's always more work to be done.
Yeah, and I can say too, from being on both sides of it as a teacher, one thing I've seen as help with other teachers is, for example, our platform is a WebXR platform, so you can just put it on a laptop. So for teachers, for their first touch point to not be the actual headset is extremely helpful. And when we're working with kids, the headset is usually maybe 4 or 5 lessons down the road. We start talking about what VR is, talking about a laptop, tablet, other non-immersive devices before we even get to it. And I think a lot of people in the tech field who have never worked in the education field take it from the other approach. And that's the disconnect that you always see when trying to implement and really understand the users.
Yeah, and quick follow-up on that one, Kai, because I love what you're doing with, Kai XR, and you talk about VR and AR not being adopted by diverse communities because a lot of the non-traditional learners out there don't feel like they're reflected in the content. Can you maybe just quickly shed light on the types of modifications you think need to be made such that VR and AR are more adopted easily across different types of populations?
Easy. When I ask somebody in Silicon Valley what they're building for their next AR, VR content, they tell me, I'm building astronauts in space who are dividing sections.
We built that.
Right? So, yeah. Which is great. Exactly. Right? But when I ask students and teachers, when I ask a student what they want to see, they're telling me a zebra, a lion. I ask a teacher what they want to see. They tell me job training. And I always see, I make sure we always talk to our users, and it's astonishing how much that is not being done. So I think that's going to be a huge thing into really making content that serves all these communities and what they actually need right now. A lot of times for teaching, one of my big pet peeves is I'll get this really cool VR experience, but it does not touch any of my standards. Nothing at all. It's actually hard. There's no time that I have to go in that detour when I have to teach a test or get these things out. So I am waiting for the convergence of curriculum and VR to come together and have these conversations as a priority and not an afterthought.
Definitely. And, moving towards another pain point, historically in EdTech, the constant pain point has always been, assessment and evaluation of a child's education and development as in real time as possible. How can, AR and VR solve these critical pain points? Both as it relates to an instructional education perspective, as well as a developmental perspective. Vijay, do you maybe want to start this one as it relates to the developmental
absolutely.
Perspective?
Right. From a developmental perspective, I think one of the biggest scaling challenges for special education is simply the lack of specialists that school districts are able to employ. And so one of the benefits of VR is you can create content curriculum that has standards and structure and built-in assessment points. Sometimes those can be automated and collected naturally in the XR environment. In other cases, those are button taps in our case, an iPad app that companions with the VR experience, but that structure enables someone that might not have the full-fledged training of a fully licensed therapist to be able to gather important baseline data, be able to come to some broader conclusions that can help create the best lesson plan possible.
Amrutha, how do you think about it? I know in Inspirit, you're so content focused. I mean, how important is it when creating content for you to think about the ease of assessment for that teacher or for that parent?
Yeah, so I think VR is really interesting just because of how much data you can collect in terms of VR. So you can actually collect heat maps of where students are looking, and we work only on VR, so I'm mostly speaking to VR, but you can collect heat maps of what students are looking at, right? And so maybe the you put them in a setting and the teacher thinks that they're looking in one location, but in reality, they're looking somewhere else while someone's speaking, right? And if that student ends up doing better, you can start drawing a lot of these parallels and actually start understanding how students learn. The other really interesting thing in VR is every time you ask a student to perform a simulation, anything that involves simulating something can be really easily tested in VR. So say you're teaching a vocational job like carpentry or something, right? And that's a skill that you actually need to practice to pick up. Rather than wasting expensive materials, you can just get them to actually do it in VR and then test them and see their technique. And so I think when it comes to assessment, yes, you can always use pop-ups, and that's what a lot of us are doing right now, just because it's an easy place to start with. But I think the more time students actually use VR and the more integrated it becomes into the curriculum, that's when we can actually start studying long-term impact of using VR in the classroom, because it's not something you can use once and then expect a result from. You need to have a sustainable solution and actually have it integrated before we can tell you, oh, this is actually improving confidence and engagement, and it's improving knowledge as well. And so I think in the next 2 or 3 years, as schools start adopting VR, we're definitely ready for it from a content perspective. I think a lot of us are. But once they actually start using it in the classroom, we'll be able to have that data and really show that VR is helpful.
I would like to add, from a virtual human simulation perspective, we build formative and summative assessments into the different types of content that we're teaching and that we approach. And so by giving learners real-time feedback and redirecting sort of the pathways that they may choose when they go down a conversation path, by strengthening their knowledge around a particular technique versus a pitfall, you can build assessments in and scaffold the learning as well, so that they course correct as they move through simulation. And then we spend a lot of time also working to aggregate a lot of that data and provide reporting so that we can look at specific behavior change and knowledge growth, and turn that knowledge acquisition into real-time application of skills outside of the simulation in real life.
Yeah, quick note on that, just in terms of data collection in VR and AR, because it's something we think a lot about. I think it's incredibly exciting, because I think devices like VR can, for the first time, pretty much capture everything, right? You can know exactly where a student's looking. You can track their eyes. You can even diagnose certain conditions just based on a VR headset using eye tracking. And you can have really visceral understanding of performance in a variety of different categories. But I think we need to be very conscientious that it's not all about just collecting the most amount of data and then running analyses on the data. And we really have to think about what the downstream effects, the second order, third order effects of collecting that much student data are, right? Does your insurance premium go up if you are a student or in college or in a public course, and they notice that your eyes are tracking in an interesting pattern? I think when it comes to data collection here and data privacy, it's very much greenfield, blue ocean. But I think we need to be very conscientious of that as sort of builders of companies, that we do it in a mindful way. Because I think the companies of the past didn't always do it that way. So something to think about.
Yeah, Deb, I don't know if you have any reactions to that. Kind of maybe going one layer deeper on how you think about collecting that data, because that data is so crucial. And I'm sure it is so instrumental in just thinking about that child's, especially their development.
Yeah, we, from the data that we collect, there's typical like usage data and sort of, how learners are interacting with simulations. And we our users include both educators and students. So we look at it from both sides. But we also collect the data of the choices that the learners take within simulation. And so often that data can be anonymous, sometimes it's not, but there's different ways to approach it and think about it from the learning goals perspective and the instructional rationale, and kind of build upon the choices that they make to provide the assessment in simulation, so that there's different ways we can do reporting. We give learners their performance feedback, but then look at all of that data as a whole and say a percentage of this population that is engaging in the simulation is turning a corner after they make one mistake, and then they don't make any further mistakes. So there's different ways to look at it and slice it and dice it.
Yeah, and this kind of brings me to a question just around, how do we use AR and VR for blended learning? And more importantly, also, when should we not be using AR and VR?
I can speak to that. We spend a lot of time on that. So we do focus on VR and STEM education. So I'll probably speak a little more in that field. But basically, you don't want to be using VR for anything that video or textbook does well. Like if you can use a YouTube video or a Zoom call to teach that particular topic, please use it. Because VR gives you headaches. You really shouldn't be in VR for more than 10 or 15 minutes. I don't like being in VR for more than 10 minutes, so I can only imagine how students feel. You should only be using VR when there's a really difficult concept that you're not able to visualize in the real world, right? So, or if it's something that you need to try for yourself in order to learn. So some examples for us are for physics, for example, when you want to see free body diagrams and your teacher starts drawing these 3D free body diagrams on the board and you're supposed to write equations. For the most part, the equations are simple, but students just don't understand where different parts are going. That's where you would use VR, because now you get to try it out and visualize it, and then you're learning based off of that, and you're really building your intuition and science using virtual reality. But again, it's something you put on for 5 minutes, you try out, and then you come out of it, and then you continue working on your lesson, right? So I think that's one big piece. And another piece is just in terms of retention and engagement. VR is really helpful for just difficult topics. So for example, in STEM, a lot of students end up dropping out because it just gets too confusing. Like STEM was this really exciting thing until maybe 6th or 7th grade when they got to see butterflies and see plants and, learn about biology in a very hands-on manner. But then as you get to more microscopic topics or just topics that you can't see, like molecules or vectors again, or cells, students just start losing interest because they're not able to see the result of what they're doing anymore. And so when you can use VR for these impossible topics and try to get students to use it, and even from a young age, they just get more excited, right, in all these fields. And then there's a higher chance they're going to come back and try it again and then just end up learning from it through having fun more than anything else.
To add to that, I come from a learning design background, and I feel very strongly that the content that you're trying to teach has to be wrapped in the engagement mechanic of the modality that you're using to serve the learning goals. So there has to be a valid instructional rationale to use AR, VR for us virtual humans and simulations beyond it's more engaging or it's more immersive. For example, our virtual humans are often provided to learners via a two-dimensional screen, and we're often focusing on a one-on-one conversation. You don't necessarily need a VR headset to put learners in that environment to take away and walk away with the goals of what you're trying to teach. However, if you are trying to teach that there needs to be more focus, or you need to immerse the learners more fully because their home environment has lots of distractions, or you're having them work on a conversation where you have to make decisions or problem solve around distractions, take law enforcement, for example, then I would argue that a VR headset makes all the more sense to further engage those specific learning goals.
Definitely. Well, so this will be the last question from me because we've had some great questions come in. So I'd love to open this to any of you. Given all the upfront costs required in building an AR and VR edtech company and the difficulty in showing traction early on, any advice you can provide any aspiring CEOs or founders in our audience today when it comes to building this kind of business?
I'll speak for our company, Florio. What's been critical for us to get off the ground is being able to establish research to show the product works, and that led us to finding grant mechanisms. In our case, we were able to find it through NIH to get a 3-year grant for just under $2 million, but it was instrumental in getting that early escape trajectory of getting the product actually built. And then in our space where we straddle healthcare and edtech, really important to get some evidence behind the system that it runs. That in turn allowed us to get over the hump with a first tranche of investors. So evidence that your system actually works, that people can use it, as well as potentially access to grant mechanisms were two things that really helped us.
Definitely. Kai, do you want to provide a perspective?
Sure. I always tell people to start where you are, start with what you have, and start with what you know. I am a history teacher by trade. I have no tech background, and my first touch point to making a company was somebody lent me a VR camera. I realized my students had never seen the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. A lot of my kids were from Mexico and El Salvador, so where we thought MLK was common knowledge for them and their curriculum, they kept missing that point. I couldn't figure out what was happening, so I recorded it. I took it back to one of my students. I had one of my students translate the I Have a Dream speech into Spanish for me. We recorded it, we put the audio to it, and that was our first, we uploaded it to YouTube, and then we did use Google Cardboard. And that was our first touch point with having no funding, nothing, just to see this. Does it make a difference if the kids can simply understand what's happening with the content? And that was the start of my company.
That's an amazing story. Real quickly, Sean, Deb, or Amrutha, any final thoughts as it relates to just building and raising capital for an AR/VR company?
Yeah, first of all, I think Kai's story is awesome. That's incredible. For first of all, I think if you're really excited about the education space and you're excited about XR, really building any kind of technology, I think you should definitely go for it on the margin, regardless as to whether or not you have the resources to do actual research, regardless as to whether or not you can get funding or get grant funding. We were really excited about getting grant funding. We were rejected from the NSF grant because it wasn't innovative enough, we heard. And so I think the important thing that when you're building these kinds of technologies is just to go for it. I think the education market is massive. Everyone in the world goes through education in some way, shape, form. And I think we should be taking a bit more risk there, especially for those in positions to take greater risk to build great technology there. Because otherwise it doesn't get built. And that's not a great reality to live in. So I'd say just go for it. Charge early too. That's just like a Silicon Valley thing, but charge for your products early. That's generally important too.
I think more about the efficacy angle, and for us thinking about success and students' grades, but it's not just about the student grades, it's about the whole child, and the idea that when you're talking about AR and VR, that immersive experiential learning leads to much stronger outcomes on the social emotional learning side. When you rethink education from traditional rote learning, teacher-led model, and you empower students to practice skills, give them confidence to build relationships, you build better school climate, and for us that's where we look at efficacy. So I would say think about your end goal and what it means to be effective in where your focus is.
Yeah, and I guess some specific feedback I have, I did a lot of marketing on Reddit initially just to see if people like some of our prototypes. And I think Reddit is some of the best advice I've ever gotten. Someone told me only build things that you would have fun using. Otherwise, just don't build it. It's a waste of time. Because in education, we tend to think this is how we're supposed to be teaching something, like this is the right way to go about something. But that's when people just don't use it anymore. And I think specifically, if you're looking for developers in the space to try building an MVP, there are so many people in these communities that are so excited to help out and to be part of education that I'm sure you could find someone, if you have a good content idea, to just work with you and build something out and see if it works. Just because it is a space where you're helping people. And most people are willing to help and at least try.
Yeah, add in that, we're talking about education. Put your product in front of a kid as soon as possible. Kids will hurl feedback at you, whether you want it or not. And it is the quickest way to understand what's happening. So don't hesitate, put it in front of a school.
Yeah, I don't think I could have ended that better. Engagement, efficacy, and testing. That's all you really need. And that's awesome. And obviously capital and support. But okay, going into these questions, and whoever wants to answer can answer. We have a couple, so I want to make sure we get to all of them. The first question is interesting. So it's, in your opinion, what age group would you start introducing AR, VR applications to, and what mode of learning would you recommend?
I'm just going to jump in because I get this a lot because we want to say VRs for 13 and older. What we actually do is we'll take kids to kindergarten, but we put on a tablet. We do magic window mode so they can move it around their cell phone or a tablet or a smartphone. And that non-immersive space is where we start. So they're used to even thinking in 360 degrees. Like if I give a magic Windows smartphone option to somebody, I have to teach them like how to just move their hand around to see it's 360 degrees. So we start very simple using a laptop, and like I can't stress enough, the headset is rarely the first touch point that we do for students.
Yeah, and I think, I guess going off of that a little bit, it's also easier for teachers to get started on a tablet. So if you can find content that works on multiple devices, and that's something that we're trying, like being able to use it on your laptop and then also being able to use it on a VR headset's really helpful, because some students don't want to be in VR. They're really like embarrassed about how they probably look, or it gives them a headache. So you just want to make sure that students have different options.
Yeah, a quick note on that though, there is certain kinds of content that can only work on like a 6-DoF or 3-DoF VR headset. The famous game Beat Saber is a good example, where you might be able to play Beat Saber on a smartphone or an iPad, you know, like try to swipe it. That's going to be very challenging. And so I do think that a lot of interesting education, kind of future facing content will kind of play into the 6 degrees of freedom, the 2 free controllers and the free face, the free head. I think it's still a little bit down the line, but it's something to consider as well. And generally for those kinds of devices, you do find VR headsets, but understandably, you do have this accessibility question which pops up.
So for us, we work with kids as young as 5 and 6, our therapy is designed to be delivered in a VR environment, and so it doesn't translate well to tablet-based delivery. So it's very important to find headsets that have interpupillary distance and straps and adjustments and can be comfortable fit, as well as to create some starter content that can ease kids into experiencing VR and give them early opportunities to opt out if they find it uncomfortable.
Definitely. And one question that came up now, I'm just looking at this, is what would be the best way to approach AR, VR for career exploration and simulation? And any advice you all have in terms of finding the right headsets and software for this use case? I know, I don't know if any of you have given specific thought to career exploration as a use case, but any ideas?
Career exploration, can we define that term? So that would just be being able to experience different career paths using VR? That's
my guess, yeah. Just being able to kind of see through in real time how you would be in certain professions.
We've had
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Like we've had a lot of questions on that. We've just had to put it on hold because we just had to pick what to work on first. But I know that like if you could get 360 videos in the view of one person, then that would probably work. But I haven't heard of any companies actually working in the space yet, but I do know that it's in high demand. Sorry, Kai, you were saying something.
Yeah, so I say, so my platform, we have, like I said, our WebXR content. And what we're seeing is when we ask kids, what do they want to be when they grow up? What is their interest? They can usually only name 4 to 5 things. One of them is usually a YouTuber, which is so we're seeing that interest in tech, but they've never seen other examples. So we have experiences like, what is it like to be an aerospace engineer? What is it like to be an illustrator? So we just have a day in the life. What is it like to make mixed reality? You can travel to Nickelodeon HQ, or you can go to Microsoft Reality Studios. Those are both 360 films that we show kids. That is that first touch point to get the conversation going. So a lot of times I think when we get into VR, we're not asking the right questions. We want to see if their grades are getting better, stuff like this. For a lot of kids, they're asking good questions now that they didn't know existed beforehand.
I'll just say in the special education context, career development is such an important part of the entire journey. And so we're starting to work on job interview training and have a partnership with Vanderbilt University where we're developing that, and an NSF grant that's helping fund that. But then separately, when you think of things like customer service and other areas where someone with special needs might need extra help learning some of the basics of those entry jobs, there's amazing opportunities in VR to create those simulation environments and be able to create the practice that kids as they become young adults need to be able to do that. So our focus is on those cash register positions, positions where we might be dealing with early forms of customer service.
Awesome. And I know we have roughly 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try to get to 2 more questions. Can you talk about where AR and VR is on the tech curve right now? How far along are we to more mass adoption?
It's to become very mass adopted. So everyone should go get VR headsets for their schools, use them en masse, unbiased perspective. I think it depends on how the COVID pandemic ends up affecting things coming out of that. and kind of the proliferation of remote versus in-person VR, and the price point of VR headsets as well, and support for schools. I think those are kind of going to be the key factors that'll determine that. As of right now, I don't know. But.
And I think on that note, the Quest 2, which I know there's a lot of backlash on the Quest 2, so I don't want to maybe use that as an example, but it's also only $300, which is cheaper than a lot of laptops are. So the fact that the price point's going down, and it's like the original Quest was launched last year, and then this one is already lower priced, I'm sure that more companies are going to release cheaper headsets. And if they just keep making it cheaper and the quality stays that high, then I'm pretty sure it's something that schools will be able to afford.
I think too that now is the time to plan ahead, and think about that will happen. The cost will come down. So we should all in this industry be thinking now, okay, how are we going to implement at scale, as soon as that price point gets right.
It's amazing because the next question from the audience was, is AR, VR feasible from a cost perspective, which you all kind of already addressed. But, to maybe end off on this question, someone was asking, they're curious to hear your thoughts on whether you think the real value add behind using AR and VR in the classroom is on the measuring of learning, like the types of data collection we've already talked about on this panel, or on the actual pedagogy side to address some of the limitations that traditional classrooms have.
I would personally say it's more on the pedagogy side than on the data collection side. I'm also a little averse to how much data is collected. I think the world just collects too much data and we don't know what to do with it. And I used to work in data analytics, so I can vouch for that. But I think on the pedagogy side, there are just a lot of gaps, right? And I think everyone on this panel is working on incredible things. And obviously they identified a gap and thought that VR was the right thing to use. And so that's why they built it, right? So I think if teachers are open to actually integrating it into their curriculum, then I think it'll automatically pick up adoption.
I agree. I think it comes down to practice as well, and if you can scale this and more teachers can adopt, you can free up teachers' time by taking away their time for teaching and allowing students to do more practicing to complement whatever is being taught.
Yeah, I think the data collection component is quite easy. You just log everything if you want. And so you can already have massive data collection with VR. You can track screens, all that good stuff. I think the thing that's actually unsolved or hasn't really been nailed yet is that pedagogy component. I think that's the most important part for any kind of learning. As a teacher, your pedagogy is the most important part, not that you get at the end of the thing that you just taught. And so I kind of view VR as just a medium of doing that. And so I definitely agree with Amrutha that I think that the pedagogy component is incredibly important.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining today's conversation. I'm bullish on the future of the sector because we have wonderful individuals like you solving these problems. And thank you all so much for tuning in.
Thank you.